From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I am Ken Davis, and on today's show, lead. Humans have been using lead since, probably the day after somebody discovered it in the ground. It's heavy, which can be helpful. It's easily molded. It's melted into all kinds of shapes, and it's really, really durable. And you know what else? It can make liquids behave really well, too. So we put it in our gasoline and in our paint. And then when we started moving water and sewage around in cities, we needed a material with all those attributes to make pipes. And those pipes worked so well that most cities in the world have lead pipes that are more than a century old, and they're still in pretty good shape, except for this one little problem. So what could go wrong? Well, as we've known for decades, when it gets into our bodies, lead can be devastating. And although we started removing lead from our environment decades ago, it still has a frightening legacy, especially in our water supply. Southside Weekly, they recently did a large-scale report called Living with Lead, and two of the reporters on that big project are with us today. Darryl Holliday making a triumphant return to Chicago Newsroom. How you doing?
Not bad, thanks for having us.
And Nissa Rhee also joining us today, one of the authors and major contributors to Living with Lead. It's a little bit old. I know this came out in December and we're just getting around to it now. I apologize. But like everything with lead, it takes time, right? So I think the key takeaway from this is there is no safe level for lead in the human body. You agree with that?
Yes, that's for sure correct. And I think a lot of the danger around the discussions we've had in the news recently about water and lead is we've really overlooked that. Concerns about water have narrowed in on this 15 level, which is really not anything scientific. It's a construction level. And we should be concerned about having any amount of lead in our water, in our homes is bad, and in our bodies it can be very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that we are doing a dramatically good job in cleaning lead out of our environment for the most part. If you think back to even the 70s when lead was pretty much everywhere. And I'm always fond of saying that my dear mother worked in a factory that is now an arts center right next to the 606 over on Kimball and Bloomingdale. She worked there for much of her life making lead toothpaste tubes. That was her job. She went to work every day in a factory that made these cylinders, and she would shape them into toothpaste tubes made out of lead. And that was in the 60s. So we don't do those kind of really stupid things with lead anymore. But now what we're dealing with is kind of the legacy, right? The really difficult stuff to clean up.
Yes, and lead is more diffuse in the environment today, so we're not just getting it from gasoline or lead toothpaste like in the past, but we're getting it from a lot of different sources, and it's the cumulative effect that's really dangerous. And while it's much better than it was in the 60s, still 80,000 kids under 6 had lead poisoning last year in the United States, so that's not a small number.
Do we have any numbers on Chicago specifically, like kind of over time? I seem to remember, and this is just completely anecdotal, but I remember that there were stories in the 70s and 80s when they were talking about lead virtually everywhere in the city, and a lot of that got cleaned up, but there seems to be some argument that some parts of the city got cleaned up better than other parts. Did you see that?
What our reporting dug up from various experts is that Chicago is something of a ground zero for lead pipes. So the estimate was around 80% of lead pipes, or pipes in the city that go from the service line to homes could be made with lead. So that, I think, added up to about 400,000 potential lead service pipes. The city is not taking responsibility for those pipes. So that leaves it up to homeowners. And we have some great diagrams and photos, stories, kind of digging into that. But yes,
you got a nice picture right here. I think this is kind of an interesting notion that the water mains under the street are I guess cast iron or steel or something, but they're not lead. But it's the line that goes from your house, that comes from the main pipe into your house, that is made of lead. And as far as I know, that was from the beginning of time all the way up to the 80s, right?
Yeah, it was actually mandated by the city. Was that your story that found that?
Tina's story.
Yeah. One of the reporters on the City Bureau team that produced this report with Outside Weekly found that the city was mandating that lead be used in service pipes. I forget up until what day,
1986.
though?
86.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So, I mean, if you live in a Chicago bungalow that was built in 1927 or 1930 or something like that, you got a lead service pipe. If you live in a moderate to small apartment building, maybe even a larger apartment building, you've probably got lead service. So you are drinking water every single day that's being delivered through about 25 or 30 feet of lead pipe. But we've not been worried about that too much because of this, what is that process called? Chelation or no, orthophosphate?
Well, yeah, there's
Explain.
a phosphate the city adds to the water to help protect lead from coming off of the pipes when the water is being pushed through. And this is like generally accepted to be pretty successful. But the problem comes really when there's any disturbance in the pipe. It could be construction nearby, or it could be something as simple as a truck rolling by your street. And then when you have the lead pipe shaking, then the lead comes off into the water and gets into your house. And that's when you see spikes in lead in your drinking water at your home.
That is really kind of a frightening thought. And also, I mean, it's one of these things about, there's no such thing as good intention. There's always going to be a bad side of it, because how much I know the city is replacing hundreds of miles of mains right now, right? I can't remember the number, but it's a lot.
Yes.
And so what's happening then is that they're digging up the street and they're replacing these water mains, and then they're tying these new water mains, they're tying the old lead pipes back into the water mains.
Yes, and Chicago's a little unique here. In a lot of our reporting, we found Chicago as an outlier as far as lead problems go in a bad way. A lot of places, the lead service line that connects the water mains and the person's house is either partially owned by the city or completely owned by the city. But in Chicago, it's completely on the homeowner's responsibility. So even though, you know, we have an opportunity to, while they're digging up the water mains and replacing them, which is a much needed service, you know, they could go in there and replace the connecting pipes too. But they aren't doing that because that's not owned by the city. Whereas you see other cities like Madison has a program where when they're digging up water mains, they also replace the service pipes.
And I'm sure that that's something that it's controversial in a lot of ways, because people don't want their entire front yard dug up either. I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but you know, if people don't perceive it as being an emergency or a serious problem, they're going to say, I don't want you doing that. I don't want you ripping up my entire street just to replace some pipe that I've never heard of. So,
And it's expensive, especially if the homeowner wants to take it on themselves. It can be costly.
how much?
I can't remember offhand, but it's at least several $100s, and then, you know, plus all the permits and construction fees.
So, I mean, is it, I guess what I'm trying to get a handle on is how serious is the lead water pipe in Chicago? How serious an issue is it? Is this something we should be, you know, lying awake nights worrying about compared to other problems, or?
So the good news about lead in water is that it's much more diffuse than in other sources. So if you're eating lead paint chips as a child, you're getting a huge kick of lead in your system. If you're drinking lead water that has lead in it, it's less. So it's less damaging in that way, and we should be less concerned about it than, say, lead paint or other sources of lead. But at the same time, as you started the show saying, there's no safe amount of lead in your body. So we need to be concerned about this, and especially as the cumulative effect of getting it from your water and then your soil, and you know, the house around you. All these things add up to be a big problem, especially when it comes to children.
There are ways that you can test, right, to see if you have a problem with your service pipe, I assume, right?
Yes, there's several easy ways. The government, if you go to chicagowaterquality.org, you can order a free water testing kit, and they'll send you some bottles. You fill them up, send them back, and you get your results, so you can tell kind of vaguely what your water quality is. The problem is it doesn't show necessarily those spikes, which is the concern, when the truck rolls by or there's construction. So you might not get a completely accurate look. The best thing you can do is get a filter on your water faucet, so either below the sink or on the faucet itself, to get rid of the lead, and then you're safe.
Some new refrigerators have built-in lead filters in them for for the water dispenser on the fridge, I think, right?
Yes.
But it is important to say, I think, to keep this in some perspective, that the other major sources, the two big sources that affected cities were the lead in gasoline, which was stopped years ago, so there is probably less lead in the air just breathing it than we used to have. And the paint, lead was taken out of paint in
78, it was illegal.
78,
yeah.
Okay. So, of course, paint stays around for decades and it's still there, and that's the worst kind of paint, I suppose, is the kind that's peeling off that a child could eat, God help us. But I'm guessing that with all the rehab that's been going on in cities all around the world over the last 30 years or so, that a lot of houses are much more lead-free than they were 30 years ago. So we're making progress. We're making progress there. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say there's more progress to be had too. There's probably more testing for lead in the city now than I would guess there ever has been. CPS tested all of their schools and facilities and faucets. The park district tested all of the parks. Lead in the blood rates have been going down steadily. There is progress, but at the core of it, it's the service pipes, which are still there.
Yeah. And it's also important to point out that practically every public school in Chicago is older than the lead paint ban, and so all of those windows and everything else all have, or not all, but vast numbers of them have lead paint on them, and there is lead paint in the schools, although it's been painted over many, many times since. So what do you want us to know in this? This is a sprawling look at living with lead. What conclusions did you come to? Should we be freaking out? I guess that's the question. Should I be freaked out?
I think you don't need to, run out of your house screaming, but there is, need to be concerned, especially if you have small children in the house. And that's really where the danger comes, because they're doing a lot of hand-to-mouth behavior where they're picking up lead from their environment, putting in their mouth, which is very dangerous. And B, because their brains are still developing and they're very vulnerable to any lead. If I have lead in my system from eating paint chips, it's much less dangerous than having my 2-year-old daughter eat it, as far as long-term damage. So I think the number one takeaway I got from this reporting is that it's really important, especially if you have children, to think about where lead might be in the environment and to get tested. It's very easy to go to your pediatrician, your primary care doctor, get a blood test, quickly get results back, and right away if you're okay. And then also think, if you do have an older house or a house with old windows or peeling paint, think about getting it remodeled. And the city does have funding sources that can help you with that if that's something you're interested in.
Do they still have that funding?
They do.
That still exists?
Yes.
I hate to sort of bring this up, but there's probably a not racially based, but racially affected issue involved in this too, because many of the people of color in Chicago live in older neighborhoods. They live in neighborhoods where there's probably likely been a lot less reconstruction and remodeling. They're living in older apartment buildings and older houses. So it's entirely possible that the minority communities in Chicago are more exposed to lead than people who live in Lincoln Park. Is that fair? Maybe not. Okay.
Well, when you look at the blood lead levels across the cities, which Darryl did at the very beginning of our reporting project, and looked at the neighborhoods most affected, you do see mostly West and South Side neighborhoods. So in that case, it's true. But at the same time, we talked to one researcher who said they were seeing a lot of lead issues coming up in gentrifying communities, where you have people coming into these old bungalows, say, tearing things up without taking the proper precautions and creating a big mess of dust. And that's a problem not only for the people who live there, but their neighbors when the dust travels. So it is something that's, throughout the city, especially with the issue of older homes.
Right. I'd say your question gets at a deeper point too, which is part of our strategy with getting this story out. There's an information gap. I think a lot of folks who might have access to, good health care, communities where buildings are newer, this is less of a problem. But getting the word out, for us, that meant a newspaper for once that you could pick it up. There's a huge digital penetration divide in the city. So the areas that we focus on, South and West Sides.
Hope there's lead-free ink on this thing.
Yeah. The neighborhoods that we focus on might not be on the internet as regularly as freely. So part of what we did was, decide to go with print, decide to use strategies like a cell phone number to put up posters around neighborhoods and get people engaged in learning about these issues and pick up the magazine.
Yeah, and the app that Darryl built goes into that too, where people can text the number 312-697-1791 with the word lead. And
we'll put that on the screen. Say that one more time.
312-697-1791. And you text the word lead, L-E-A-D, and it will prompt you asking for your zip code, and you can get information about sources of lead in your neighborhood.
There's been for years, there's been a discussion about the effects that lead can have on young kids. That if they are poisoned with lead when they're 1 year old or even younger, that there's a kind of a reflection that comes in when they're 12, 13, 14 years old, that their behavior is affected. Do you guys buy into that? Is there more concern about an infant being affected with lead than there is about a teenager being affected with lead?
I definitely buy into it to a certain degree. We began the reporting on this I'd say it's almost been a year ago at this point that the pre-reporting began. And it began on an assumption that violence and environmental health could be correlated. I think over time we've discarded that. Through the reporting, we dug deeper than just making a pure one-to-one association, because there isn't one. But we do know that lead causes IQ drops. It causes increased aggression. There are real mechanical, practical things that happen when you're exposed to lead. So yeah, to a certain degree, I do.
Yeah, but I think to your point, as we were saying earlier, the minds of young babies and children are so moldable, and so lead is affecting them much more dramatically than it affects teenagers. But then sometimes we don't see the results of that until they're school age or older, which is why early intervention is so key.
I learned something very interesting from your reporting, that in a very young child, if the brain is affected, there are ways that the brain actually can compensate if the right intervention is taken. It's not just a situation of, oh yeah, this kid has been poisoned with lead when he was 1 year old and therefore he's doomed to a life of deprivation because of it. There are things that can be done.
Yeah, and one of those is, you mentioned earlier, is the chelation drug therapy, which actually pulls lead out of your body, and that's a very extreme thing. But a much more simple and cheap and effective way, if you have a child who has been exposed to lead is just to increase their stimulation all around. Talk to your children a lot, play with them, make sure they live in an environment where they're learning constantly. And you can really make up for a lot of the damage, especially when it comes to intelligence and socialization, that is done by lead.
So their brain is still forming, and if it's being challenged, it's like any other muscle. It'll rise to the occasion. Or
yes,
something.
but there's again a limited window for that. So you know, if you start that in the process in grade school, when they're already behind with reading and writing and speaking, you know, it may be too late.
So where is the window?
So 0 to 3 is the golden spot.
Really?
Yeah, and which is why, you know, there's talk in Illinois of opening up the early intervention program, the government program, where nurses and therapists go to children's houses to any child who has been exposed to lead or has high lead levels.
So if you have a 0 to 3 kid, even if you live in an affluent neighborhood, maybe in a you know, loft that has just been remodeled or something, you should get tested. Get your child tested.
Yeah, the pediatricians recommend that children get tested at least when they're 1-year-old and there's 2-year-olds. So if you're going to your doctor regularly, they should be doing that, and you can ask to see those results if they aren't shared with you.
Is that a blood draw? Is that how that's done?
Yes, yes.
Okay, well, so I can't help but come to this conclusion that this is a really serious issue that's facing us, but it's been facing us for a long time, and it is gradually, very gradually becoming less of a threat to us. I mean, I don't know if I was supposed to, but when I got to the last page of this thing, I felt more optimistic than I expected to be. I thought, oh boy, let's settle in for more. We're all about to die, and it's not quite like that. Am I misreading your work?
Not at all. I don't think we intended for it to be a doom and gloom piece. It goes back to the information gap. A big part of what we're doing is trying to really get to people who may not have heard all the past stories, all the past information. We wanted a solutions piece at the end. And Nissa did a great job at sort of getting at what the current state that we are in looks like, balanced with what the future could be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to talk just briefly about the schools, because obviously this is the thing that when we're talking about young people, where are they? They're in schools, right? Sure. So we know that the Chicago Public Schools did a fairly quick job of going around and sampling all the schools. I think they get to every school. Are you satisfied with the work they did? Have they done what they needed to do? And if so, are there solutions? Because it's going to cost money. I don't know. I don't know how to read what happened with CPS.
So I think there's due credit to the city for testing all of these facilities without a lawsuit occurring first. The data is now available. We also made it public on the web. One thing that we did found that is still an issue is that there's no concrete policy within CPS about what to do. Now that we have this information, now that we know more, what do we do with the kids that are coming through? Yeah. There's still, to this day, no written official policy.
And this is the same for the Park District too, I assume, right? I don't know.
As far as policy, or and I mean, with the park districts, there's even some question what exactly the remediation effort is and what it will be. And parks are a little different because they turn their faucets off during the winter, which can build up lead and create even an annual problem. So it's something that really needs to be addressed in a long-term way, and not just, we did this once, okay, we're good.
And I have no idea. I never thought about it until I read this, but you got a drinking fountain that's out in the middle of some huge park somewhere. Is that being serviced with a lead water line? And if it is, there's hundreds and hundreds of feet of lead pipe that, it's like, I don't think so. I don't think I want to drink out of that. But I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. Maybe that's not the way they're plumbed. But it does raise the question of whether the city needs at this point to do some kind of comprehensive sort of master plan for remediation and how we're going to get to the end of this. And particularly the water service lines. I mean, I got to tell you, I just don't understand how a city like Chicago with, how many water service lines are there? Hundreds of thousands, there must be, right? How do you do that? I mean, and if you're not replacing the water main, do you just start going into people's houses and saying, well, we're gonna jackhammer your basement floor now and take out the water meter and dig all the way out to the street because we think that you might have a little bit of a problem with some lead here? It's a really tough policy question.
Absolutely. I think there's a step to do before we get to that point. And I think now that we're sort of over the hump, so to speak, there's a good deal of education to do. Nissa will be holding 3 events in March at Chicago Public Libraries. I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but it's an effort to keep this reporting going and keep getting the word out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Darryl's completely right that, there's a lot of misconceptions and fear, and there are some concrete steps that us as citizens can do without waiting for the government to start digging up lines, start changing policies. So we will be talking about that in March. We're doing 3 events, one on the west and one on the north and one on the south side at public libraries. So if you go to citybureau.org/lead, all that information is up and all the events are free and open to the public.
citybureau.org/lead,
yes.
And that will lead you to all of these articles too.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. I think we have all learned some really devastating lessons from Flint. I mean, it just goes to show you that you don't even need to be digging up the mains or anything else. If somebody makes a boneheaded decision somewhere along the line and starts feeding the wrong or the improperly or non-treated water into those pipes, everybody's screwed. And so it's kind of one of those weird things about our infrastructure that we just rely on it. We just depend on it. It's always there, but there's always something that can go wrong. It's just so weird,
And I mean, one of the researchers we talked to said, everyone's concerned about Flint, but really the levels of lead in children that we're seeing in Flint, we've been seeing in Chicago for years. So it's just not getting the same attention, and it's something that really we thought is deserving of the public's attention and awareness.
And the levels that you've been seeing in Chicago for years aren't necessarily from the water pipes. They're from multiple sources because there are many vectors that are delivering lead into our bodies all the time.
Yes, that's correct,
Okay, well, tell me what I should think. Both of you. You get 30 seconds to tell me what I should be thinking about this.
Man, you have anything?
All right.
We've probably said
we've
it all.
known about lead as a problem since Roman times. It's been documented, and we know what the solutions are today. Other cities are doing it, other states are doing it. We really need some political pressure in Illinois, in Chicago, to work towards these solutions, which have been proven to, reduce lead exposure and help children in the long run.
Excellent. A good way to conclude. All right. Thank you both. Thank you so much for coming by and talking with us today. Darryl Holliday and Nissa Rhee, both with Southside Weekly, and this is their thing, living with lead. And City Bureau. And let's not forget City Bureau, the great City Bureau on the South Side. We love your work, and thanks for being here and being part of it, okay? We will see you again another time with another show. You can look at all of our shows right here by going to this address and seeing us on YouTube. You can also listen to us on SoundCloud.com, and just type in Chicago Newsroom. You can listen to all of our shows, too. See you next week with another show. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.